Hello everyone, and welcome back to our tutorial series learning Unreal Engine 5. Today we're going to discuss working with materials in Unreal Engine, including a quick tour of the material editor, what we use materials for, the material node and its inputs, some common nodes within the material editor, and how to handle texture files. We'll finish out by making some materials and implementing them in our project. Thanks again for joining us, and let's get started. As you can see, we're picking up right where we left off in our previous tutorial video with our Learn Unreal Engine project. We've got our content folder with art and code folders created, and we're going to go ahead and work within our art folder today, and within that, our materials folder. In order to view the material editor, we first need to create a material. It's as simple as right-clicking here in our content browser. And one of the basic assets that we can create is a material. We're going to call this M_plastic. And that'll be the first material that we create later. I'm going to go ahead and double click that to open it up. And here is our material editor. I can right click and drag to move around the graph here. I'm just going to slide that all the way to the right there. Let's take a look at what we've got. Here in the middle is the material graph. This is going to be where we spend most of our time creating our material. On the left, we have our viewport, which allows us to preview the material in real time. Below that, we have the details panel, which, similar to the details panel in the engine itself, allows us to see a highly detailed list of attributes and other information about our material. Up top, we have a menu bar. And below that, a toolbar with some common tools that we'll be using throughout. Down here on the bottom, we have our stats panel, which will give us basic statistics about our material and its performance. And finally, on the right-hand side, we have a menu that we can open up called the palette. And this has every potential node that we could add in our graph. You can either search through it this way, or if you know what you want, you can type in. So if we want a vector, it'll filter all of the different vector nodes that we could use. Looking at things in more detail, we'll start with the viewport. We have some options here for which camera view we want to use. Some lighting options, and some display options. We can also choose what sort of mesh we want to preview our material on. For the most part, a sphere will work perfectly fine for most materials. Sometimes you might want a cylinder or a cube. Or a plane. And notice the back of the plane is invisible. We'll come around to that in a moment. Or we can use a custom mesh from the browser, but we don't have any meshes loaded in yet, so we can't quite see it yet until we import a mesh. The plane display mesh is very useful for things like sprite sheets and particle sprites. But we'll start off with sphere. You can left click and drag to move the camera around, or you can right click and drag to zoom in and out. Middle click and drag will allow you to pan. You can also use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out as well. And as with the editor viewport itself, you can always hit F to frame up on your object. We're not going to go over everything in the details panel, but it is good to know that there are some important options here, such as material domain, which allows you to dictate what kind of material you're working with. Is it going to be a hard surface material? A deferred decal? Light function, volume, post-processing material, UI material, those sorts of things. As a subset of whatever you choose here, you have the blend mode, which allows you to choose how this material is going to interact with the camera and the way you can see things through it or not, and how it blends with things behind it. And below that, you have a shading model, which gives you some options for things like subsurface or clear coat, hair, cloth, eyes. The two-sided option here can be very useful if you are working with a plane, or working with a material that you know you're going to see the back of at some point. You just turn on two-sided, and it'll display on both sides. As you keep going down, we get more detailed options, more advanced options, and more niche options that we won't go over right now, but they can be useful for doing very specific things. Let's talk for a moment about what we use materials for. A material defines how you see things in the game world or in your virtual environment. Anything that you need to see will have a material. So our cubes here, we go to the details panel, all have this solid blue material. Our level geometry all has this prototyping gray grid material. If I have an explosion, that's going to have particle systems attached to it. Each of those particles will carry a material. If I have a glass window, that'll need a glass material. And so on and so forth. Some typical use cases for materials are hard surfaces, liquid surfaces, translucent materials, emissive or glowing materials, as we mentioned, particle sprites, and if you're making a 2D game, your 2D sprite sheets will work with materials as well. Let's take a look at our material node and its inputs. We're not going to go over all of these, but just the main ones. The big three are base color, metallic, and roughness. Unreal Engine uses a physically based rendering model where those three will do the most heavy lifting. Base color, as it sounds, defines what color your material is. Currently, there's nothing plugged into it, so it's just black. Metallic defines whether your material is metal or not metal. Usually this will be a binary choice between 1 and 0, although there may be some use cases where a middle value is wanted. Roughness, also, as it sounds, defines how rough your material looks. Is it shiny and smooth? Or is it rough and not shiny? Emissive color can be especially useful for things that need to glow. Opacity and opacity mask are useful for translucent or transparent materials. Opacity is for a material that needs to be fully transparent. An opacity mask is when you need to drive transparency through a mask image or texture. Normal map, also referred to sometimes as a bump map, will determine how light interacts with your object or with the material on your object, and can give it more texture, bumpy feeling, or indentations, or scratches, things of that nature. World position offset, unlike normal map, will actually allow you to manipulate the vertices of the mesh and push them around a little bit. So it will actually create bumpiness rather than just simulate it in how the light looks at it. Ambient occlusion allows you to simulate the self-shadowing that happens within the crevices of a surface. So if you have the light on in your room, and you look up at the wall where the wall meets the ceiling, and you see how shadows gather right in those little corners, that's a very simplified version of what ambient occlusion is. Refraction allows you to simulate as if you're looking through a glass material almost, right? Or water, or something like that, that refracts light and bends the image behind it. And the other ones that we haven't gone over here can be useful, but are a little beyond the scope of our video today. So I say, let's go ahead and get started and see how all of this works with this plastic material, and then we'll work our way up through some other materials to demonstrate other uses. So the first thing I want to do is define a base color. There's a couple of ways we can do that, but I think the easiest way is to use a vector 3 node that will give us red, green, and blue values. I've already got vector selected in my palette here. If I just keep typing vector 3, I get a constant 3 vector. I can just drag that in. And here I have RGB values to work with. Coming out of the top pin would be all 3 of those together. So if I just double click on that, I get a color picker. And let's go with a green plastic material. Actually, let's go red. Pull a little bit off the saturation, and a little bit off the value. We can also control these with 0 to 1 values for RGB, or we can control it with hue, saturation, and value. If you know the exact color you want to use and its hex code, you can put that in here. We'll hit OK to save our color. We're just going to drag that top pin into base color. Just like blueprints, which we will cover in a future video, the logic flow always works from left to right or from output to input. If I want to remove that connection, I can Alt-click either the output or the input, and it will break the connection. We'll reconnect that there. And while I have this node selected, you can see the details panel, being context sensitive, switches to whatever details are pertinent to this node. Another way to create constant 3 vectors that you'll find useful is if you hold down the 3 key and click anywhere in your material graph, it will create a vector 3 for you. We don't need that though, so we can just delete it and move forward. Just like we just did with the vector 3, we can create a scalar constant by holding 1 and clicking within the material graph. Remember, I said metallic is usually either a 0 or a 1. And we're making a plastic material that does not need to be metallic, so 0 will work perfectly fine for our purposes. Lastly, we want to define the roughness of this material. Right now it looks, sort of like a middle rough. but we want it to be smooth and shiny. So we're going to create another scalar constant. I'm going to set this value to 1 briefly, so we can see what a fully rough material looks like. You can see how the light almost doesn't interact with it at all. If we bring that down to 0.5, that should look pretty much like what we started with. If we bring it all the way down to 0, it will be as smooth and shiny as possible. You can see it's now reflecting other surfaces or other images within the environment. That might be just a little too shiny for what we want though, so let's inch that up a little bit. Let's start with 0.1. Let's go maybe 0.2. That's pretty good. And you can see how you can quickly iterate on these things and get it to exactly your liking. So if I don't quite like that red color, a little too peach colored for me, I can drive up that value a bit more. Drive that up the saturation a bit more. And now I have more of that pure cherry red. We'll hit apply, which applies all of our changes in this material to how it's being used in the world, which we haven't implemented in the world yet. We will save our material and back out to the editor. Implementing our material within the editor is as simple as highlighting an object and dragging our material onto it. You can also access the material through the details panel. I can just drag this and drop it right there. One other way to apply a material is to highlight the object. And there's a button here called Use Selected Asset from Content Browser on the material attribute in the details panel. And that will use whatever you have selected in the content browser. As a side note, if I am somewhere else in the content browser and I want to get to that material, so let's dig deep into one of these folders. So I'm in a completely unrelated folder now, and I want to get back to this red material. All I have to do is hit this browse to m_plastic, and it'll take me back to my materials folder. If I want to duplicate this material, I can right click and hit duplicate, or use the hotkey Control D. So highlight Control D, and I'll get another material. We're going to call this one m_gold. I'll hit enter and bring up the material editor again. And now we're working on our gold material. Well, I definitely don't want it to be this red color, so let's go ahead and change that. Something a little more yellow, or a lot more yellow. And I'm imagining something sort of cartoony, not too detailed, something you might see on a Mario gold coin. I don't mind this roughness value for now, but we definitely want it to be metallic to show that it is gold. I'm going to set metallic to 1. And now you can see that the reflections and the way that the light interacts with this material is a little more blurred. And it looks like a metallic material. Not sure if I love the roughness value that it's specifically set to right now, so let's try taking it all the way down and see what that does. It's very chromed looking now. Very shiny, very reflective. Not quite what I'm looking for. Let's maybe go to 0.4. That's pretty good. It's still a little bit yellow for me though. I think we can maybe take some of the saturation out and take the value down a bit. And we just sort of mess with it until we get exactly what we're looking for. I think that's a little more what we're looking for. I'll hit OK. And as always, apply and save. Go ahead and close our material editor. And let's go ahead and apply that material to, I don't know, let's say this cylindrical object or group of objects here. I'm going to grab all of the objects and drag the gold onto their shared material element. And now we have our gold cylinder there. So you can see how easy it is to iterate on materials and create some quick, very basic materials to use in your game. What if we want something a little more, I don't know, complex or complicated? Well, I'm going to create a new material. So we'll duplicate this one and call this m_sand. We could come in here and turn off the metallicness by making it non-metallic. Oh, it already is. So there we go. And make it pretty rough. Give it like a 0.8 value. And a nice sandy color. And call it a day. But if we want something a little more detailed or customized, we're going to need some texture files. I'm going to delete all of this and go back out to our content browser for a moment. Just as a bit of organization, I'd like to create a new folder to hold our texture files, which we will just call textures. And oddly enough, I think I had created one the other day and then deleted it and given it a red color, and it actually maintained that red color on the folder, which is perfect. So we'll come in here to our textures. And now we need to import some files. I could just open a File Explorer window and open it up to the folder where my assets are, and then grab my sand material or sand texture and drag it in and drop it. And that works perfectly fine for importing. Or I can right click and up top here, import, and then navigate to that same folder. And import from the Unreal importer. I'm going to grab this sand normal map, as well as this one labeled sand, rough, metallic, AO, and height. You'll notice I also have a stylized sand here, which we could use, but we'll stick with this one for now. So now I have these textures and I want to use them. All I have to do is bring up my material graph, zoom back in on where we wanted to work, shift click to highlight all three of those, and drag them into the material editor. We're going to move them around to give us a little extra space. So just for the base color, we have our RGB pin here, and that should hook up nicely there. Normal map, same thing. RGB pin, and take that into our normal. And you can see if I disconnect it and reconnect it, that this bumpiness will go away if I disconnect it. And as I reconnect it, we get that bumpy, sandy texture. For our final map, recall that it was labeled rough, metal, AO, and height. The AO stands for ambient occlusion, and height technically could be used for world position offset, but I don't think that's necessary for this material in this use case. The reason that we have all of those maps labeled is because we have packed them into the different channels of this texture sample. So if I bring up the texture sample, you can see at the top here, I can select between the 4 different channels, red, green, blue, and alpha. If I turn those off, you can see that this will be our roughness map, as that's labeled first, roughness. If I want to look at the metallicness, I just turn that off and look at the metallicness, which is all black for this material. The ambient occlusion, you can see that it is driving shadows in sort of these lower areas in the sort of sand dune type material. And finally, our height map, if we wanted to use it. Actually, that's backwards. Blue is supposed to be our height here. I only know this because of having created it, but I actually packed these in backwards. So this would be our height, and this would be our ambient occlusion, which makes much more sense because our shadows are packed into the crevices rather than defining big, broad shadows in the lower areas. So it's good to know I'll need to use the alpha for ambient occlusion here. And then at some point I will need to go back and fix that texture file to be in the correct order, or relabel it. So, red for roughness, green for metallic, and alpha for ambient occlusion. And it might not look like a lot has changed, but we have now clearly defined how rough we want it to be. And these little pebble areas should be a little less rough than the rest of the sand. We've given it some shadow information, very light shadow information, and basically told it not to be metallic. And this is going to be a very common setup for you, using 3 textures to define a whole material. Base color will always need its own texture because it needs all 3 channels to define the correct color. And normal map will also always need its own texture. Most other things you should be able to pack in with other texture files along with it. Packing your texture file saves you both time and space because we only have 1 image instead of 4 different ones. I'm going to hit apply and save. I'm going to close that texture file and drag our window off. Let's apply our sand material. We need to go back up to our materials folder, grab our sand, and we'll just drop it on the floor here. One thing you'll notice right away is that this looks way too big. It was scaled way too big for what we need. These are supposed to be little pebbles, not rocks to trip over. There's a couple ways we could deal with this. If we were using our own 3D models that were unwrapped, we might unwrap them specifically to predict what the material might look like on it. But if we need to fix it within Unreal, we can do that. I'm just going to drag off to the side here. And I'm going to use a node that is pretty common. I'm going to right click and type in hex board. That's going to bring up our texture coordinate node. And this will allow us to manipulate the coordinates of a texture file or multiple texture files all at once. I'm just going to drag my pen into the UVs of each of these texture samples. And I'm going to try to scale this by about, we'll call it 4 for now, and see how that looks. You'll notice nothing has changed in our editor yet, because we need to hit apply, save, and it did update when we applied. It's already a lot better, but I think we can do more. You don't want to scale it down too much because you don't want it to tile too heavily and look repetitive. But I think we can go a little bit smaller. We'll go 8 to 8. And that looks pretty good. I'm not immediately noticing the tiling. The rocky elements do look a little more pebble-like and not quite so big. We could probably even go up a little bit more if we wanted to, but I think this is good for now. Just to see exactly what it looks like when we're playing. I think this is all right. We'll stop our simulation. Come back in, make sure our material is saved. And close that. The next material I'd like to take a look at making is a basic water material. I'm going to open up my textures file again and click the import button here on the left. And I've got some files saved for a water material. I'll open those. Another way to create a material from a texture file is if you right click on the texture file, the top option here will be create material. It's currently named after the texture file that we created it from, but we want it to be m_water. And actually, I'm going to call it m_flowing water. You can see that it automatically loads our texture sample and plugs it into base color for us and gets us started with the material. We still want our normal map and our others, so we'll bring those in. There's our normal map. There's our packed textures. We'll go normal to normal. And we'll just double check our textures here again to make sure everything's correct. Looks like we're in the correct order this time, with the height being in the alpha channel and the ambient occlusion being in the blue. No metallic information and 0 roughness because we want it to be shiny and very stylized. We'll go ahead and highlight all those again, save it, close it. So, going by the label, which we can see down here, rough metal AO height, red for roughness, green for metallic, blue for AO. And again, we're not going to use height right now, but if we wanted to, we would drag our height into world position offset and set up that. I feel like this sphere isn't giving us quite a good enough preview for this material currently. I'm actually going to change that. Cylinder. Let me see a little bit more of the information. Next, I'm going to hit apply and save just to make sure we've got all of that saved. And then We called this flowing water, so let's give it some movement. Another common node that you'll use with moving materials is called a panner. You can see when we typed in panner, it's under the coordinate sub-menu. That's because we are going to be using this to drive the coordinates of these texture samples in different directions. I'm going to plug this into our UV coordinates. And nothing happens. That's because we have not defined yet a speed for it. We could either drag off a pin here and customize our speed with some math and give it sort of a dynamic speed over time. Or we can just give it some values in here. Let's say, I don't know, 0.35 on the Y. I'm going to hit enter to save that. Our texture starts moving. I kind of want it to flow downwards though, so we'll go with negative 0.35. And just to give it a little bit of variation, we will give it 0.05 on the X. We'll drive that up a little bit to 0.1. You can see it's now flowing down mostly and also over to the side a bit. I still think I do want to go back down to that 0.05 though. Because I don't want it to look like it's going diagonally, but I do want it to vary. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. We'll hit apply and save. And let's put it on something in the world here. Maybe we'll put it on this object here. Unfortunately, these are not custom unwrapped, so we can't exactly tell how it's going to look. Like you can see it's flowing up there, down there, across there. It's a little frustrating, but that's what we're going to have to deal with unless we want to use custom geometry. One thing I'd be interested in though is it's reflecting outwards, almost as if it's like an aquarium. But I wonder if we can make it so that we can actually see through it. So let's actually go ahead and make this a translucent material by highlighting our material node. And coming over here into material domain, actually surface is probably good for now. And then come down here to translucent. You'll notice it takes away some of our nodes like metallic and roughness and normal. But it opens up the opacity for us to access. The other way we could do this is as an additive material, but it's pretty much the same idea. I kind of like the idea of working with translucent here though, so we will do that. You'll notice that we can't really see through the material yet. And that's because we're still driving the base color. We actually don't want to do that. And we also haven't defined opacity. I'm going to turn off base color and instead use emissive color. That'll give it a little bit more of a glow. And then we want to define opacity with a scalar value between 0 and 1. We'll start with 0.5. It's a little bit too light. Go up to 0.8. Maybe back down to 0.7. And I think we're honing in on what we want there. There are other ways to get the roughness and metallic back depending on your shading model and stuff like that. But I think this is good for our purposes today. We'll hit apply and save. And go check it out back in our game world. And here you can see it is not reflecting anymore, but we can now see through it, which is what we want. If this were some sort of finished product and I wanted to actually use this piece of geometry, I might also come into the panner and change things around a bit. Maybe make it slower, or I don't know, change the coordinates a bit. But for now, I think this is fine to demonstrate how to do a translucent material. The last material I want to work with today is, what if we had a custom static mesh and a custom texture for that mesh, and we wanted to work with that? Well, we need to bring in our static mesh first. We'll navigate to our static meshes folder, and just like before, import, and come back up to where our static mesh is located. And we get some import options here. The most important ones right now, we don't want it to be a skeletal mesh because we have not defined any bone or joint information for it. And we do not want to create a material. A lot of times your 3D artists will, in the program where they're designing and unwrapping this object, have some sort of test material on it, something to see it just, prototyping. We don't want any of that, and this would bring that information along, so we'll just keep it as do not create material. Make sure we're not importing any textures. Everything else should be good. Hit import all. Our message log says everything's good. And we have our little RoboBuddy static mesh now. I can double click that to open it up. And it looks like everything imported correctly. Go ahead and close that. Navigate back to our textures folder, and we've still got this material that we created in here, but we want that in the materials folder. I'm just going to grab that, drag and drop it in materials, and click move here. So we want to bring in our custom textures. We will hit import, go back up to our textures folder, and grab our RoboBuddy files. You'll notice we have the three that we've been working with: base color, normal. This one labeled occlusion, roughness, metallic. We'll talk about that in a moment. And we also have an emissive texture. Let's go ahead and grab all of those. Bring them in. And just inspect them real quick to make sure everything looks good. I know it's a little chaotic, but that's because this is a custom unwrapped object with custom painted textures. And it's already been tested in a different program where we were painting, so I know that all of this looks pretty good, even if it looks kind of crazy and stretchy and weird right now. We'll close that, and we will look at our weird one here. Again, we are texture packing. This one is only containing 3: occlusion, roughness, and metallic. The reason this is in a different order is that this was created in Substance Painter, which by default exports things in this order. So as long as we pay attention to the order it's labeled as, we should be good. Occlusion, roughness, and metallic. As opposed to the other textures we've been working with for metallic, this one actually has custom information in it, and we'll see why in a moment. So go ahead and load those up, close it all back down, and create our new material. We'll call this m_RoboBuddy. And before we start working with it, let's just take a look at that emissive texture real quick. Very simple, it's just the word danger in yellow, and that's perfect for our purposes. So, open up the material. We've already got the base color, but we need the other 3 textures. So let's drop those in. Separate them out. I'm going to pull emissive off to the side for a minute because we'll talk about that in a moment. Now remember earlier we couldn't preview on a custom mesh because we didn't have one imported. We can fix that now. If I just navigate to my meshes folder in the content browser and highlight RoboBuddy, then come in here and click this preview mesh. That'll load him in and we can preview the material on him. I'm going to make my window a little bigger here. Actually, make my preview window a little bit bigger too. And he's looking pretty good for a start. Colors are all right. The screen is a clean black. We've got our metallic bits up top there. This will be a painted metal with some corrosion, especially around where there's joints and corners and underneath. Everything looks pretty good there. Let's go ahead and start connecting up our material. Normal to normal. Again, red is occlusion. Green to roughness. Blue metallic. And you can see we've got much more detailed information now in here. The arms and the metal bits up top all look more metallic. We've got his shiny black view screen being really the only clean thing on here. The yellow painted metal on his clamps. Red painted metal on his joints. And everything looks pretty good. Let's talk about emissive. I mentioned earlier, emissive is how you can give your texture some glowing elements or make it all glow like a pulsing glowing thing. And here we've got a simple emissive texture that we can just plug in straight to emissive color. You can see we get that yellow kind of glowing thing there. With emissive, you can actually push those values past 0 to 1. So if I come in here, do my texture sample, oh, it's not going to let me. You would see that these red, green, and blue values, if you could look at the texture itself, would all be between 0 and 1 themselves. And if we want to push that past, but keep them all the same sort of proportion, what we need is a multiply node. So I'm going to hold M and click to get a multiply. Or I could pull it out of the palette or right click and search for multiply. We only need the one for now though. I'm going to plug my RGB information into A. B, we will leave hard-coded to 1 for the moment. And plug that in, and it's the same. If I drive that up past 1 to say 3, and then watch what it does here in the preview, you can see it's a little more glowy. We go back to 1 versus 3 versus something like 10. You can see it gets much glowier there. But what if we don't want that to be a static glow and we want it to sort of, pulse like in and out a little bit? Well, we can do that within here with a little bit of math. And it'll be a constant pulse. So let's start with what we'll call it a sine wave. And if you recall from your math class, a sine wave alternates between 0 and 1. So if I plug that in here, what it should do is go from a black screen to a low glow and then back down. Actually, it goes -1 to 1. So it'll be more often black and then pulse up to 1 and then black. Oh, I've got an error because I'm missing an input. We actually need to give that sine wave a time input because it needs to know. You imagine a sine wave going up and down across an XY graph. It needs to know what that X is to give us the Y output. So we put in time. You can see very quickly it's blinking. We can smooth that out a little bit. So let's change our period on the sine wave to, I don't know, let's try 4. A little better. We might come back to that in a moment. But we want to fix the fact that it's going below 0 to -1 to really smooth this out. So what we want to do is take it from being a range of -1 to 1 to being a range of 0 to 2. And then dividing that by half, be a range of 0 to 1. So the best way to do that is come in here, hold A to get an add node, and D to get a divide node, and then plug all these in. This should be a much smoother glow now. But what if I don't want it to go all the way down to 0? Instead, I'd rather it go from a low glow to a bright glow. Well, what we can do is move this off to the side. And then multiply this to a brighter value. Let's say 6. Plug that in. And we're still going from 0 to 6. Which is not exactly what we want. Instead, what we want to do is interpolate between two values based on our 0 to 1 data that we're getting out of our divide node here. And we'll do that with what we call a linear interpolation, or LIRP. If you hold L and click, you get a LIRP node. What that's going to do, if we zoom in here, is it will alternate between whatever's plugged into A and whatever's plugged into B, based on whatever value is coming in at the moment to the alpha. So our divide will be driving our decision making here. We'll plug that into the alpha. And then I want to alternate between the base 1 and then the 6. So I'm going to drag this into our multiply instead. You can actually get rid of this multiply. And we'll alternate between the 1 and the 6 multiplied value. And then we will plug that into our emissive. All the way to 6, back down to 1. 6, 1. Now that doesn't feel dangerous enough, so we can come back here to our period now that we've smoothed everything out and drop that down a bit. It's a little closer, maybe all the way back down to 1. It's even closer, we'll try 0.6. That feels a little more urgent. And now we have a glowing material using emissive. We could also do stuff like come in here and pan that across the material, but that would be a little more complicated. I think we're going to leave it how it is for now. We'll hit apply and save. And close our material editor. Now I could drag this into the world. And apply the material directly to him as we have been doing. Oh, my material is still stuck in my textures folder, so we'll move that back up to materials. And just apply that directly. And we've got the glow going. Everything looks correct. Our metallic bits look metallic. Our painted bits look painted. And everything was looking good there. The other way we could handle it, if we knew that we were going to have multiples and we all wanted them to have the same texture, you can see if I drag in another static mesh, he doesn't carry that same texture, or that same material, but we can come into the static mesh itself and say that its default material should be our RoboBuddy material. And now, I delete these guys. Any RoboBuddy that I drag into the world will default to our mesh with the material. But if for some reason we had a different custom material that we wanted one of these guys to be, we can always come back in and override that here directly in the details panel. But for now, we'll leave him with his correct texture and material. And that's going to do it for today's video. If you have any questions, please let us know in the comments below. In our next video, we'll be talking about the basics of Unreal Engine blueprints, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. As always, if you like the video, feel free to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you can keep up with our upcoming videos, and hit the bell icon to get notifications when we drop future content. Thanks for stopping by, and hope to see you again soon.